delighted to welcome Charles Leon, who's a local resident at Sheen, who's, I don't know if you've seen them, but if you haven't, have a look at the stall afterwards. A tremendous and very gorgeous sketch journal of Richmond buildings. And he, I believe, talks about how a picture tells 1,000 words about the people that lived and live in the buildings. So without further ado, please welcome Charles Leon.
Good evening. I'm going to launch straight in. So basically, earth, stone, wood, metal, water, these are just merely materials. They don't have any meaning. Materials and information are in fact meaningless unless we decide how we assemble them and associate them in such a way that they have meaning for us. Now, on the table there is just a little bottle of water, except that it's not actually just water, it's actually snow from the top of Mont Blanc, which I personally collected. There's a rock there, which is a mountain that I once climbed. See, it's the way that we assemble and associate something, and the meaning and the purpose that we actually give it, and the journey that we take it on, that create the stories and the culture that we share and that we live by. Now, buildings too have their stories locked into them, and all we have to do is to try to find the key to unlock them. So buildings collect meanings, they collect memories, and the purposes that we actually give them. Now, I sketch basically because I love to sketch. It's just another way of seeing, it's another way of understanding. Buildings represent the thinking and the dreams of those who actually built them, who inhabited them, and sometimes even destroyed them. And buildings have secrets locked into them, and we are curious beings that want to strive to understand more and to find the pattern. Now, buildings show us the pattern of people's behavior, and sketching is another way of seeing and another way of understanding. Buildings are my primary source of information, and they tell us how people lived, what they cared about, what their aspirations were, how over time their purpose and their behavior may have changed. History also tells us who we are and how we got here, what we belong to and what we don't belong to. So through sketching, I gain another layer of understanding, and it's a portal into stories that we inherit, the culture that we build, and the continuity that stretches from the past to the present. So what I'd like to do this evening is to explore why we are compelled to understand history and why we seek meaning within it. But I'm going to give you a little bit of background first about me, is that in 2019, I dissolved the hotel design company that I ran for about 25 years, following a disagreement, let's say, with my business partner. Now, losing a company is a bit like having a death in the family. I needed time to grieve and to process it and to figure out what to do next. Then in March 2020, of course, the world went into complete lockdown, and isolation compounded my loss, but there was one reprieve. We could go out for short walks in our local areas, and that was allowed. So I've always been passionate about sketching. It's how designers like me communicate. So I began sketching the buildings of my local area during these walks and posted the drawings online. It was a way, if you like, to keep myself entertained and to explore the stories of the buildings and the people of my neighborhood. What happened next was that the response was completely and utterly overwhelming. People were eager to learn more about their area and to share their own stories and their own knowledge. What started as my own personal distraction evolved into a sort of communal project. So before long, people were asking me, well, what are you going to do with all these sketches? And I said, well, nothing, really. I mean, they said, are you going to make cards? Are you going to make a calendar, exhibition, a book? So at first, as I say, I had absolutely no plans. I was just enjoying the process. But one local woman encouraged me to put it all together into a book. And that's how I became a self-publisher. I'm going to go back a little bit further, about 45 years before this. I sat in an exam hall taking my A-levels in French, and I'm actually bilingual, and I was readying myself for university, where I was going to go and study PPE at Oxford. Everything was mapped out for me. Halfway through the exam, though, I suddenly realized that this was not the path that I wanted to go on. So I walked out the exam, mid-exam, and went to art school to study theatre design. So that led to a fantastic career, I have to say. I worked at the National Theatre, I designed for the English National Opera, and eventually gravitated into film as well. And then a chance encounter sort of took me into an international hotel design company and working on some of the world's leading hotels. So after 5 years with that company, I thought, right, I'll do this on my own. So I started my own design consultancy. Now, for many, many years, I absolutely loved it. We were a very close-knit, very happy team. But as I say, it all came a little bit crashing down in 2019 because of my former business partner's actions. Despite that, the one constant throughout my career has been sketching. It's always brought me joy and helped me stay grounded. So, back to the first book. So this is the first book, which was Barnes, Mortlake and Sheen Sketch Journal. And I initially thought, right, I'll print 100 copies. If I sell 100 copies, I'll be doing really well. That will justify everything. But that's not what happened. Demand absolutely outstripped supply, and I ended up having to order many, many, many more copies. That's sold over 1,200 copies to date. So a copy of that book then found its way to Kew Gardens, to somebody at Kew Gardens, and they commissioned me to create a sketch journal of their buildings. And I can assure you there are a lot more buildings than you might think, as I'm sure you will attest, no doubt, if you're doing the palaces. So I worked, and then after that, on the basis of that, I worked with the Museum of Richmond and Simon Fowler, who's here, and created the Richmond Sketch Journal. So now, that's the Richmond Sketch Journal. So now I'm on to my fourth book. I'm trying to do a book a year, which I have to say was a little bit ambitious. So the fourth book is now the Thames Path Sketch Journal, of which there is a sample copy here because they haven't quite arrived yet. They're being printed as we speak. So it's basically an illustrated walking historical guide to the Thames Path from Hampton Court all the way through to the Thames Barrier. Sorry. And it features the stories and histories of key buildings and structures along the route. So why do I sketch buildings? Well, for me, buildings are more than just structures. They are containers of meaning. They tell us who we are. They tell us who our communities are and what we actually belong to. Our interaction with our environment shapes our identities and binds us together. An observation brings understanding, and understanding is essential because without it we cannot find either meaning or purpose. Now, I believe that there is an absolutely fundamental reason why we are obsessed with understanding and finding meaning and purpose, and that's what I'm going to explain. So our brains are actually hardwired for pattern recognition, and that's a skill that's been honed through evolution. Music, language, humor, these are all forms of pattern that humans have developed to survive and to communicate. So when we observe an event and then another event, we start to form connections, creating patterns, and eventually making predictions. Yet from these events, we create understanding and meaning. Now, I think this is a biological imperative, for if you couldn't predict, you likely wouldn't survive. Now, evolution is not just the survival of the fittest. It's the survival of the most creative, the most adaptive, the most collaborative, and the most communicative. So, where does this thinking come from? We don't see the world as it is. We see the world as we are. We temper everything we see, everything we feel, by what we think and what we know and what we think we understand, and by the stories that we tell ourselves. Our structures are inherently linked to our survival instincts, and at the heart of that is pattern and story. So I'm going to step back one step further. So as I said, our brains are hardwired for pattern. Science and math, in my opinion, and history for that matter, are just pattern recognition. Music is just notes and tones pitched over time. Decoration is symbols placed across space. And language is symbolic, repeatable, recognizable sounds and intervals that convey meaning. I think also that humor exploits pattern by sending you down a path towards a conclusion, and then at the very last moment it suddenly changes direction unexpectedly. As Chuck Palahniuk said, there are only patterns, patterns on top of patterns, patterns that affect other patterns, patterns that are hidden by patterns, patterns within patterns, and if you watch close, history does nothing but repeat itself. What we call chaos is just patterns that we haven't recognized. What we call random is just patterns that we can't decipher. See, patterns give meaning to things. It's different similarities and similar differences. So when we observe an event and another, we see, or we fabricate, a connection. We find correlations, and sometimes those correlations are spurious. From connection, we see pattern. From pattern, we form predictive theory. And from that theory, we form an understanding. From understanding and knowledge, we form meaning. So it's event, event, event. Or as British historian Arnold Toynbee said, it's just one damn thing after another. From observation, we assimilate information and build the pattern. From pattern, we create understanding and meaning is absorbed into our worldview and our self-image, and this feeds back into how we interpret new information. So pattern and sequence are fundamental to the human condition and survival. In fact, I think they're so fundamental that they come from our basic need for survival. Because if you couldn't predict, you died. And the way our brains predict is by encoding our biases, our assumptions, and our patterns, and those that were useful in the past. So if you assume, for instance, that the rustling in the grass behind you is a tiger, a quick reaction may save your life. At worst or at best, you will see that it's just the wind in the grass. But it's always better to assume a false positive than a false negative, saying it's just the wind, and then you might end up dead. So we are storytelling creatures. We're cursed or we're blessed with imaginations and creativity and the desire to make changes. And storytelling is how we convey patterns and meaning to each other. It's how we make sense of the world, whether through grand narratives like religion, politics, philosophy, or for that matter, construction. Stories bind us together, defining our values and holding our communities together. Now, there have been, I know, some great societies that didn't use the wheel, but nobody's found any society yet that hasn't told stories. So if we cannot immediately find a meaningful pattern in events, then we impose one. So this is why conspiracy theories take hold and why humans manipulate narratives to inspire or control others. Story binds us together in groups, in our communities, our tribes, and even our interests and our buildings. There's a lot of studies that show that when ordinary people do something wrong or break a promise or commit a murder or some such thing, they usually fold it into a narrative that denies or at least diminishes their guilt. So the line between truth and reality and falsehood is very thin, and stories are how we share, learn, and pass on information, transform and change emotionally, culturally, and behaviorally. So manipulation by storytelling is probably our most powerful tool. However, to manipulate, particularly with the use of history, You have to have a sense of what causes will achieve what effects. And like ancient alchemists, you need to be able to predict, either rightly or wrongly. So we rely on prediction to feel secure and to avoid the unknown. And yet, it's our creative minds that actually thrive on the very thing that we fear, which is uncertainty. In order to be able to predict, you must guess at the next event, in the sequence or in the pattern. You must read the signs, and patterns allow us to predict what will happen next and to potentially manipulate the future. So those who learn to manipulate stories hold the balance of power and persuasion and are able to mobilize nations. Buildings and structures are one of the great legacies of behavioral manipulation. Mind you, for that matter, actually, so are taxes. Donald Trump's strength, for instance, to be topical, is his unpredictability and his ability to manipulate or influence a future outcome. So stories are sometimes so powerful that they have the capability to change the world. I hope you recognize all of these. I can come back to it. Story and uncertainty are the driving forces of creativity and of history. Our need to understand, to predict, and to create order from chaos is fundamental to who we are. We strive to create a predictable world, but to do so, we must step away from what we think we know and explore uncertainty. If you sat 50 sketches in front of the same subject, you would end up with 50 different points of view. So as I said, we don't see the world as it is, but rather as we are. We have a point of view. Now, I'd like to explain how I approach a project. Previously, it was a matter of convenience and circumstance. The lockdown gave me an opportunity to, in my environment in which to begin, and following that, I was simply asked by Q to prepare a sketch journal for them. And then I thought, oh, I might be onto something here. However, the Richmond book was actually a choice, partly based on convenience, because it's very close to home for me, and partly because I was curious to know how things, or why things like, for instance, a fireplace underneath a window in the White Cross, or why Friars Lane is called Friars Lane, and what was Richmond Riverside development like before the development. So the idea for the new book, the Thames Path actually came about after sketching Richmond Lock. Now, the river has always been part of my life. I've always lived very close to it. I've walked, I've jogged, I've cycled on the towpaths. And at first I thought I would do all the bridges of the Thames and all the crossings of the Thames from source to sea without fully realizing the scope of that. So gradually it trimmed down, and now the new book is called The Thames Path from Hampton Court to the Thames, well, it's actually to Tower Bridge and a little beyond, with all the significant, or the buildings I think are significant along the way. So projects are actually born out of curiosity, and I think most things are. Now, I always take far too many materials with me when I sketch. I never know what I might need, and I always end up using the same 2 or 3 things, which is stupid, I know. So the sketchbook is I've got some examples of the sketchbooks on the tables there, of the original sketchbooks. They're 300-gram watercolor paper by Seawhite, and occasionally I use slightly larger paper from Langton, which is also cold pressed 300-gram. Simple 0.5, 0.7 mechanical pencils, but one is HB, and the one that I really like has got a 6B lead in, which I love sort of scribbling with. But my greatest love, and it really is a love affair, has been with my fountain pens. All have got fine nibs in them, and one of which I've had for more than 30 years. So ink, for those of you who draw or don't draw, or paint particularly, ink is quite tricky in a fountain pen. So after years of searching, I found a waterproof ink that works for fountain pens, and it's by D'Art Trementis. And my watercolors are my half-pan professional colours from Winsor & Newton, and it's in a portable palette that I've had since I was at school. Yeah. So, sketching plein air on site, in front of the subject, is often quite tricky. This last year was very rainy, and that made it very, very difficult to sketch because I'm outdoors. And people, of course, are another factor. Sometimes they love to stand behind me, and they love to comment, and sometimes it can be a whole crowd of people. Once while sketching, all sketches go through an ugly phase. That's just the nature of the thing, but you have to plough on. And one person who was standing behind me was watching me, and whilst I was on the South Bank, and he commented and leant over and said, "You're not very good, are you?" Oh, great. I tend to sketch directly in pen with virtually no preparation. I quite like to be totally committed. The hardest thing is the first mark on paper, and sketching is nothing more than making marks on paper that have meaning. That's all it is. Consistency and confidence are the absolute key. I don't think it matters if your perspective is distorted so long as it's consistent. So long as I draw shapes, not things. So that means that I don't let what I think I know interfere with what I actually see. Because one of the greatest difficulties to overcome with sketching, I think, is to draw what you actually see rather than what you think you know. And that comes out particularly in portraiture or in drawing the human figure. We think we know what eyes and noses look like, and then we end up drawing what we think we know rather than what we see. So your mind often plays havoc with you by telling you that it knows what something looks like rather than sketching what you see. So we have to overcome our own assumptions. Painting I do less and less of it on site, mostly because it's difficult, it's clumsy, it's awkward, balancing palettes, water, brushes, sketchbook. I often do the drawing on site, or mostly do the drawing on site, and then take a photo, return to my comfortable garden office, and paint in a more controlled environment. So research. Right. I start to research around the building the minute I've started to see the building, and I quite often make notes on my own sketches. I read a lot. I take notes on a mind mapping software. Sometimes I like to write in sketches. Wikipedia is probably the greatest invention in the world, I think, and I use it extensively. And that will often point me in the direction of some of the sources of information, and wherever possible, I will try to go directly to those sources. But above all, I will look at the building and the structure, and most importantly, for me anyway, is the plan. The plan of a building will tell us how people move within a space. So the plan really does reveal how people behave in a space and what its function is. And buildings are made and used by people. Now, I know that there's also trains and planes and plants and animals, but essentially we design for human existence. Buildings can tell us about our attitudes at a moment in time, and also about personal pride, civic pride, power, who has the power, utility, function. We can learn a lot about the past by simple observation of a building and its structures. And writing, well, as you can see, it's a continuous process. I make notes as I go along and then adjust them and add to them and then gradually shape them into short pieces of writing. For the Thames Sketch Path Journal, that ended up being nearly 70,000 words. That's a decent novel size. So next, you have to start assembling it all, putting it all together, and putting it into the shape of a book. Now, fortunately for me, my daughter is a graphic designer, so she set me up with some templates, which these are based on. But inevitably, whilst using the templates, I tend to recraft things and format them and show, so that they show the narrative journey. Indexing. I didn't think, well, first of all, I have to say, I didn't think editing, I think editing is a much undervalued skill. And it's essential to get different eyes on a project that has been with you for at least a year, and for some time, for some of you, I'm sure it's been with you for many years. You just become completely book blind. You just can't see what you've written until somebody else looks at it and says, my son actually did the editing, he's got his PhD and everything, but he did the editing for the Thames Path Sketch Journal, and that was tough, I've got to say. You don't want your own son telling you that you've done it wrong. Anyway, books like these, all of these books that I do, they need an index. Now, I didn't even know that there was such a thing as an indexing skill. Well, there is. There really, really, really is. So I found this wonderful lady in Scotland who helped me with the Richmond book, and I had her lined up for the Thames book, but unfortunately she died, she had cancer, and she wasn't able to complete my project, so I had to go somewhere else. So the book is assembled. Now it's time to print, and I wanted desperately to print here in the UK. Unfortunately, it's just prohibitively expensive. I tried to get it printed in Italy, where we printed the Q book, but that was also way too expensive. So I print, I'm afraid to say, in Turkey. I'm sad about that, but it's the reality of producing something that has to be profitable. So in amongst all of this is marketing, PR, distribution. I've got loads to learn in this area, and let's just say it's just work in progress. So the book is complete and nearly in the hands of the public. So, as I say, sketching is really it's a point of view, it's not reality. And perception is filtered through our histories, our stories, and our assumptions. Now, the brain works in relationships, not in absolutes, detecting patterns, comparing them, telling stories, and seeking to understand, to complete the pattern. You can't separate meaning from context and from its environment. So the meanings that we attach to something and its context is the experiences that we feel, because context is everything. So, in 1865, a chemist called Michel-Eugène Chevreul was employed by Louis XVIII to find out why people who were buying from his royal tapestry manufacturer were complaining that the colours of the threads were not as vibrant as when they saw them in the salon. He wanted to know, was something happening in the manufacturing process that was making the colour much duller? Now, Chevreul meticulously tested every stage of the process of making a royal tapestry, and he found absolutely nothing. But what he discovered changed how we understand perception forever and changed art forever. What Chevreul discovered was that what had changed was the context that people saw the colours in. People's perception of a colour had changed as a result of the adjacent colours. And if you don't believe me, I'm going to show you. So, we see 3 cats up here, and they're all slightly different colours. Yes? Yes? Yes, good. Wrong. Let me just zoom up a bit. They're a bit closer in colour. Let me just now take away the background. I promise you, I haven't altered the colours, I haven't cheated. They are all the same colour. If I go back, honestly, they're the same colour, but they change. I'll give you another example. So this is all about perception. Right, so on the left, they look like fluted columns, or the way that, and that's because the light is graded from light to dark, from left to right. But they're not. None of those are fluted or toned in any way. If I reverse the top line, you'll see, if you can, those are the same colors, the same tones, they're just reversed, but because the light is not striking it in the direction that it was previously, we do not see them as fluted. I hope that's correct. I hope that's what you see, because that's certainly what I see. These lines on the right are all parallel. But if we mess it up a bit, well, suddenly it's very difficult to see them as parallel. They are parallel, but it's difficult to see them as parallel. So Chevreul's discovery led to changes in art and in science. As I said, it led, via Delacroix, it led to the Impressionists, who wanted to paint colours that were more true than realistic. In science, it led to the understanding that we don't see reality as it is, but in context and as we are. Detecting differences, that's making patterns, and telling stories, which is pattern making with meaning, is so integral to the functioning of our brains that when our senses are deprived of different relationships, they can in fact start to shut down. Marcel Duchamp said, when a person folds socks, it's just folded socks. When an artist folds socks, it becomes art. I'd say that if you put that in the context of a gallery, it becomes art. There's a very, very famous prank, if you like. Two people went into an art gallery and they happened to have a pineapple with them. Whether that's strictly true, I don't know, but they placed it on a small table. When they came back a week and a half later, they found that the small table had been covered with glass and was protected, and it was treated as a work of art. So, as I say, clay, stone, wood, metals are all meaningless until we assemble them and give them meaning and context. So, history gives us context. Am I on the right slide? Yeah, I think so. So history gives us continuity and context. Observed patterns of the past help us to understand and predict the future, apparently, except for the unpredictable and creative nature of human beings. Most important, history helps us to bring order to chaos and to see the patterns of society. History also gives us the tools to analyze and explain problems of the past. It positions us to see patterns that might otherwise be invisible in the present, thus providing a crucial perspective for understanding and solving current and future problems. So the built environment allows us to observe and understand how people and societies lived and behaved. And history helps us to understand present-day issues by asking deeper questions as to why things are the way they are. So science, maths, and the arts are all depend on pattern recognition, either in dissonance or in harmonious pattern. And the recognition that something does not follow an expected or predictable pattern alerts us to the fact that the pattern that we thought we understood may in fact be wrong. So buildings, like documents, are stories, and stories are our sort of touch points into seeing the pattern of who we are and how we got here. So history, for me, is narrative and constructive patterns. We seek to understand the past by determining and ordering facts, by putting events in their context. And from these, we hope to explain the decisions and the processes which shape our existence. So sketching and researching buildings is the study of people, of communities, of actions, of decisions, interactions, and behaviours. And it encapsulates themes which expose the human condition in all its guises and that resonate throughout time, be that power or weakness or corruption or tragedy or triumph. Buildings are the pattern of how we live and who we are. I'm going to finish with a little story, if I may, because that's what I've been talking about. So let me go one further on. Right, on Kew Green, there is a building named Capel House, which I sketched in the Kew book. But I knew nothing about why it was named Capel House, and indeed who the Capel family were. So this naturally opened my curiosity to find out more. Well, it turns out that the Capel family were an essential part of the Kew community during the 17th century. They owned land stretching from Kew Green to roughly where the Temperate House is now. That's all well and good. That doesn't sound very exciting, but wait. During the English Civil War of the 1640s, Arthur Capel, first Baron of Capel and a royalist and a politician, helped Charles I flee to the Isle of Wight and his wife. He was imprisoned in the Tower for his crime, and yet he managed to escape, only to be betrayed, coincidentally by the waterman who actually helped him to escape, and recaptured. And on March the 8th, 1649, he was beheaded. His last request was that his heart should be buried with the body of King Charles I. Now that didn't happen, but the heart was kept by the Bishop of Winchester, who was Bishop Duper, and whose almshouses are here in Richmond and also in Walton-on-Thames. And they were kept in a silver box. Following the restoration, the heart was presented to Charles II by Capel's son Henry, and Henry became the first Baron of Tewkesbury and inherited the property at Kew, and then he is considered to be one of the founders of the Botanic Gardens at Kew. Now, unfortunately, the box has been lost. Nobody knows. Maybe it's buried under the floor of Ham House or somewhere like that. Who knows? But buildings and structures are the patterns of how we live and who we are, and they represent our attitude and to ourselves, to our status particularly, and our communities and our shared stories. And they give us context and texture to the pattern of our collective histories. There's a short video here, but we can now discuss, if you like, or ask questions, or challenge me, or if you don't believe me, I'll defend myself. But basically, that's it. You're welcome to have a look at that in the meantime. This is basically a journey through, through the sketch journey. So I have one last thing for you. I don't know if this... Well, maybe. Let's have a look. Do you want to hold one end? And I brought with me... This was done in front of the TV, I confess. But this is... If you grab that. This is the elevation of the whole of the buildings of the Green. Or the Georgian side. So I thought that may be fun to show you. I also have some of the original sketchbooks there. I didn't bring the bigger paintings, but so there we are.
How does that seem to do?
I don't know. I think. Thank you. So I guess that took me as long as the series, no, not Game of Thrones. What were we watching? I can't remember anymore. But I mean, it was several days, nights.
Wow.
But mostly once I'd finished sort of doing the main works, I'd just sort of sit. We have a desk that sort of faces towards the TV. So whilst the noise was going on, and most of it's rubbish anyway, so I decided to just keep going. And this was done from photographs, not on site. Very difficult to do that. So thank you very much. That's it. Any questions?
Well, thank you very much. What a fantastic talk. Let's give a round of applause.
That's okay.
Who'd like to ask the first question? We've got roving mics, so Shirley is the question.
Thank you very much. Would you be able to, say, look at Capel House again and tell us how you see the structures and patterns in that and what it tells us?
That's less so the patterns because I couldn't get inside the building. And that's not their own property. It was just the name of the property that spurred me through to find the story. So it's basically just a touch point. So it was, or a starting point, if you like. The actual building itself is nothing to do with the Capel family. It has inherited the name. But, and their original buildings do not exist anymore, unfortunately. And it's also, it's on the herbarium side of the green rather than the Kew Gardens side. So sorry, I can't tell you more how the building inspired it, but certainly the name did, because I think I had picked up the name whilst reading through. There's one particular book, and I've forgotten the name. I'm sure somebody here knows the name of the guy who really was the historian of Kew Gardens. And whilst reading through that, I picked up this name Capel. And since then, I've been fascinated by that whole period of civil war, and then through Charles I, and then the Commonwealth, and then the Restoration. So that's a fascinating period of history.
Question at the back there. Simon, at the back there, lady. Lady at the back.
Hi, if we can just get to the river, the book, I think you said your one that's just coming out. Having myself walked to the source before walking in the other direction as far beyond the barrier as one can, I was just wondering whether you had any ambition to walk the other way and sketch some of the very interesting buildings that are obviously more spread out.
Yeah, I mean, there are some from Hampton Court, sort of back east. It's sort of east. It's not exactly, west. It's not exactly west, but there are some amazing buildings, and that may become a future project. In fact, one of the projects that I'm thinking is to break the main Thames Path Sketch Journal into 3 parts, and then to continue to add to it to get all the way back to the source. But it's quite a long way, and there are some stupid logistic problems, like how do you actually sort of walk that path? I don't have that much time to be out and about, but it will probably happen. I mean, I quite like cycling as well, but it's not always possible. Once you get beyond sort of, I don't know, beyond Windsor or wherever, it gets a bit trickier. No.
Question at the front. Julian? Oh, wait, can you wait for the mic, please? Sorry.
Sorry, which is your favourite book and why?
Can you...
My favourite book?
Yes, of those, your books.
Oh, of my books?
Yes, of your books.
Well, I mean, they're all my children. How can I choose between them? I think...
No, I'm very interested that you've done the Thames Path, because I've done that. Just at Birmingham. Sorry, at Chertsey. So we've just got to do from Chertsey to the Thames barrier.
I think...
So your book might be...
I think, like my children, they've all got very different characters.
And you've done it as well?
Yeah, I did. I've certainly walked it all. I walked both banks.
But you haven't done the Thames, the early bit, Wiltshire?
No, I haven't really. That was my original ambition, was to do Source to Sea. And then I realised the enormity of the scope of it, to do all the crossings alone.
Because there's some beautiful bridges in Oxford.
Oh, I'm sure there are. I'm sure there are. And also through Windsor and Eton and all the rest. Yeah, absolutely. What can I do?
Another question? Yes, Rose here. Simon.
I wondered, because drawing buildings, so many straight lines and right angles, what proportion of sort of rulers and protractors and things do you use, or is it all freehand?
Nothing.
That's
I
amazing.
use no rulers at all, ever. Actually, that's not entirely true. If it's very large and there's a complex perspective, I may just put a couple of the vanishing points in. But very rarely, because I tend to play with the perspective. They look believable, I think, I hope.
Completely.
But 99% of them are no straight lines. And the perspective, if you really analysed it, you'd see that it's not quite right. But as I said, it's a question of partly confidence and partly consistency. There's a wonderful artist called Ian Fennelly who completely distorts perspective, but it works. And it works almost in the same way that we like caricature, that we like to see the character or the essence of it. And it's something that, that I think only drawing can do, that photography, maybe it can now, but it's very difficult to get the emotion into a photograph as it is with a drawing, with a sketch. You're there, you have a specific relationship with that building at the time that you're there particularly. And that's what I love, is that the feedback that a building gives you. And somebody asked me earlier, what's my favourite building of all time? And I know by chance, only because it's so wonderful to draw, is the National Theatre on the South Bank. It's just a spectacular piece of geometry. And I love drawing. I can go back again and again and again and again to draw it. But likewise, what was the Courts, that is now the William Grant building, is also a beautifully proportioned building. And I bet it was horrible when it was Courts. But having sort of refurbished it and re-looked at it, it now takes on a new life. And you can see that people behave differently in different buildings. There's that very famous broken windows theory, is it called? Which was where they realized that people were behaving badly in New York because it looked so terrible. So they tidied it up, and suddenly the crime rate dropped. Apparently that's not absolutely the reason, but as I heard a confession recently that somebody said, well, that wasn't quite the full reason. But it's a nice story. Again, stories, very, very important.
The question there?
Sorry.
I was just wondering if your first effort is the final effort, or whether you have to start again sometimes on the buildings.
Oh, yeah. I actually, what I haven't brought with me, and I won't show you, is I always keep a rough sketchbook. So in the rough sketchbook, I'll do a very rapid sketch, maybe 5 minutes, maximum 10 minutes, either just looking at the tones or just looking at what am I going to do with this, or how am I going to compose it. Once I've worked that out, then I go straight in, and I usually get my fountain pen out and just go for it. And to some extent, I think one of the problems that a lot of people have with sketching is hesitancy and a lack of confidence and a belief that you're going to be judged for what you do. And to be honest, I don't really care. But I'm fortunate because a lifetime of sketching has brought me a lot of skill as well, or muscle memory, let's say. So I don't have to think too much about it, but I always do a very quick, rough sketch, which I keep very personal, and I don't show anybody, because sometimes they're terrible drawings, they're awful. But I know what I'm looking for in that drawing, and so yeah.
It's another question. No? Sorry.
Thank you. I was just wondering, if you're sitting on the riverbank with a lovely bridge or something in front of you, or a building,
Yep.
and you're about to sketch it, and you see an arch or a turret or something.
Yeah.
You're portraying a story that you're having in your head, I think, as you're saying, because everybody has a different story from it.
No, I don't think the story is
how
quite...
How does it work?
Okay.
How do you show what...
So the story hasn't developed at that moment. It may start to, once I start to make a choice about the composition, well, that's a choice, that's a decision, so that's the beginning of a story, if you like. I've got a point of view. The way that I approach drawings is I won't draw an arch or a turret, I will draw the shape. And that, I mean, whenever I teach drawing to students or to young designers, I always say, do not draw the thing, draw the shape. And look at the negative shapes as well. So, for instance, you know, a lot of people drawing a bridge, they may do, right, here's the big span of the arch. Well, I might not do that. I might look at sort of the bit of light that just happens to come through there or is cut off by a boat or something. Because the virtue of that is that then you're looking at all the negative shapes and you're doing the proportionate shapes rather than the thing that you think you know. Because nothing is worse than, you know, and you see it with children particularly when they get beyond 7 years old, is that suddenly they'll start sort of trying to draw a face and making it look good, and they think they know what the eye looks like and everything, instead of just sort of doing what they do quite normally and quite naturally. So the stories develop with the sketching, with the involvement, with the feedback from the building. I mean, if it were, say, I don't know, Hampton Court Bridge, then you can sort of feel the essence of Lutyens coming at you because he's so distinctive. And some of that is based on knowledge as well. That, okay, so I like Lutyens and I've seen a lot of his work, and you see it in the bridge straight over with the brick and the stone combinations. So you know that there's something more going on there. Then I may do some research, and so the stories basically develop. But I think it's actually a really good way to look at any art is asking yourself, what is the story that the artist is trying to say? Why have they taken this point of view? And that's what I meant about if you sit 50 people in front of the building, they will all do it differently. Even though they may look very, very similar, they'll all approach it slightly differently. Some of that is skill-based, but some of that is just the decisions that they make along the way. So, yeah, did that answer the question?
There's another question. Julian, actually, there's another question.
At the back.
Yeah, just following on from what you just said about artist intention, I really like the pieces where you had a lot of detail in the buildings, yet the human subjects and vehicles were merely outlines. What was your intention behind that? I mean, I think we could probably all interpret it differently, but what was your intention or message?
One of the other main things that I teach when I teach drawing is intent. Decide what you want to do before you do it. And with watercolour painting, you have to have a plan. You can't, well, you could. No, it's not fair to say you can't. You shouldn't try to attempt watercolour. You can with oil, but not with watercolour without a plan, because it depends so heavily on negative spaces and negative painting and working from light to dark rather than dark to light. So that makes it very, very difficult. But intent is absolutely everything, because if I look at it this way or this way, that's a different intent. And then if I decide to push or exaggerate the perspective, as I have in many, many drawings, sometimes, you know, you'll see a tower and you'll think, okay, so a lot of people would, even if they're sitting below it, will draw it straight edges or parallel edges. And they're not. So you can push it. You push, you exaggerate. I think good portraiture does a similar sort of thing, is that it looks for what's the story, what's the essence, if you like, or what's the intent, and then pushes hard just to get to that point, rather than, although it needs to be a likeness as well, that's another layer that it needs to have. But I think intent is probably the first thing that any artist ever needs to decide, because just to paint pretty pictures, that's half of an intent. It's not really committed. And that's also probably why I don't do very much construction in my drawings. I go straight in. I think, if it's not right, I'll just adjust and adjust and adjust and adjust. There's no problem. Nobody's checking on me, so why not?
Great. Well, thanks very much, Charles. What a terrific
You're welcome.
talk. Let's give him a round of applause.
Thank you. Just to mention, if you did want a copy by chance of the Richmond Sketch Journal, it's here. And Simon very kindly did all the fact-checking for me on it, which was wonderful. And the new book, the Thames Path Sketch Journal, will be out in about 4 or 5 days. If you'd like a copy as soon as it arrives, I've got a list if you want to leave your name and details, then I'll get back to you and tell you when it's ready. That's it.
Thank you. And here's a token of our appreciation.
Oh, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Oh, that's lovely. Oh.